lots of food for thought. There is lots of very interesting crossovers. Today, the event is about participation. So I might kick off with sort of a question around that. So you both mentioned the importance of participation, as well as the importance of participation with stakeholders. What are the benefits of that? And what are some challenges? And what are some ideas or things that you have implemented that may be able to cross over some of those challenges to support more greater participation with diverse stakeholders? Quite a broad question.
Okay. I think in the context of the work that I've experienced, well, just to use the framework again of thinking across scales and who's operating at them, that's not an even distribution of people. Most of the people are towards the one-to-one level where there is the high touch, and that's particularly for the affected community members. That's the kind of reality that you'll start with. How you can start to open up those stories is the first part, because from social justice, you know that one of the core principles is letting people know that they've been heard. So how do you do that to begin with? And then from there, that really starts to establish trust and agency. I can't tell you the amount of times I've been in country doing field work, and we'll have meetings, and we sometimes have to have them in the office at the bank. And so people come in, but you know they're not being honest with you. And it's not because they're trying to be dishonest, but it's just, it's a bit overwhelming coming in as a citizen to the World Bank office. You can't help but feel the imposition of that agency on top of you. So people feel like they have to give us the answers that we want to hear, and they feel really intimidated by that. They don't know what's at risk if, you know, the funding doesn't come through, or the lending operation doesn't come through, or the policy doesn't get designed. As much as we're trying to tease out all the unknown things that we don't know. So we found that it's much more beneficial to be out in the field, walking around on their farm, trying to understand their stories about the way their lives are affected. Completely different conversation when you're in their space. So the participation part is how do you surface a more transparent and honest conversation? Because for us, it's about trying to get to that space of unknown unknowns, so that all the things that we go out on into the field for, which is we're looking for surprises, things that surprise us. And surprise is just another word for insight. So that, to me, has been the most valuable part of participation, is the surprises.
So sometimes I feel like the work of community change is almost a new riff on democracy. Like, how do communities start being, like, charting their own future more? And I see from a citizen perspective, like, sort of place-based reform and collaboration is a way to be able to exercise more leadership around the lives they want for their children and their families. So for them, I think the benefits of participation are really high. But I also see more that people who have more formal power, people who hold budgets and people who make policy decisions, often feel really detached from what it's like to be, you know, to live in community and to be, other than their own community, of course, but often detached from the places over which they're making decisions. The benefits to me for them for participation are extraordinary. I see people who entered into public life, whether it's through philanthropy or through government, because they wanted to make a difference. And seemingly the higher you get, the more detached you are from the work. And so that when participation processes are well convened, well designed, everyone gets to bring their best self. And I find people who have otherwise been previously detached become quite attached. And actually that unlocks the type of change that wasn't possible before. So to me, there's a citizenry piece around we get more say, but there's much better decision making and use of funds when people become properly engaged.
Yeah, thank you. So we're Social Design Sydney, and we are interested in design and social outcomes. So my question is the question that I kind of open with. How might design support participation and systems level change and social change? Big question.
Do you want me to start again? Okay. The things that I've noticed accidentally, so you probably saw in that image the little Playmobil figures that we've had. Now, I've done that with people from special forces and the military and stuff, and it's because the work that they're doing is so complex, the systems are so complex. How do you make the thinking visual? Because it's hard for someone else to hold everything they're hearing from somebody in their head and to work through it. I mean, imagine it would be like playing chess without the chessboard in front of you, but you're trying to remember all the moves that the other person made. It's just not, it's too difficult. But also there's something special about using actual physical figures of people because it does humanize it. And you do, I've seen, having done that a few times, changed it to different sort of objects. It just doesn't have the same effect as it does when you put people in there, and it changes, it does become human-centered. So it's really to illustrate that design has a lot of capacity to bring in terms of how to make the thinking visual, how to visualize the complex nature, and so that everyone has a common operating picture that they're working from to begin with. And it's one that's like, we're all bringing jigsaw pieces, but we don't quite know the picture that's going to form until it starts to form through the conversation. And there's something about that which is also very designerly, which is taking that risk and not knowing that it's going to be planned, but having faith in being able to say, well, through the actual process, we believe in the process enough that something will eventuate. And it's never really failed me. So actually, that's not true. There's been a lot of kind of things I probably would do again, but over the longer range run, I would say that it certainly moved the needle and taken practice and had some lot of bigger successes, yeah.
So I struggle with the question because I'm not a designer.
And can I reframe it for you though?
No, but
If I can have a crack, I can have a crack and you can tell me.
Sure. Yeah.
So, what I learned from working with community is that people don't learn through reams of stuff to read. People want a dialogue. People want to draw. I recently had the extraordinary experience of being involved, of learning about an evaluation where very senior women lawmakers in an Aboriginal community won an evaluation award because they drew their evaluation findings. And in fact, an amazing evaluator came alongside them and triangulated the data through in-depth interviews to their own drawings. And they presented their evaluation report as a 4-metre dot painting. And thankfully that funder gave the painting back to them. But it's sort of like, this is how people work. Like, honestly, if we chose it as social change agents, we wouldn't choose to do change by reading 180-page reports and policy documents. It's just not the way we function as human beings. When you bring people together who have differences of point of view, but they're all righteous, they want to see change.
amazing things happen when you curate those conversations really well. So whether it's through, it's all in the experience. How do you design things that allow people to bring themselves and their ideas forward and constructively manage conflict? I mean, to me, that's the art of this work. Like, how do you channel conflict into change? And people need structures and support to do that. And I think that is what design can do.
Thank you. So we chatted once before about the infographic that you, the community, that was kind of related to this question. So I guess I'm curious about how to empower communities and how to help communities gain a voice and how to get those voices heard. Any kind of thoughts around that? Well,
so for me, at the very heart of this work, it's renegotiating power. And what Burke and other communities that have done similar work to them has shown is that for them, they believed they didn't have power because they didn't have the data. So they asked for the data, and after a lot of negotiating, they got it. When they looked at the data, they went, yeah, look, this tells our story, but it's not our full story. In fact, even getting the data actually It was more about they were authorised. They empowered themselves. They asked for something they felt locked out of. But that data became proof that they can influence the system. The fact that they could access it and then they used it to make decisions. And in fact, as much as possible, the system is now aligning behind the strategy set locally. I don't know if that's happened anywhere else. Like a
community, families have set strategy, and now government departments at all levels are doing what they can incrementally over time to align behind it. It started because they created an artefact that said, these are the outcomes that we are experiencing and these outcomes aren't acceptable, and actually we want to create the table where the negotiations for change happen. We don't want that table somewhere a long way away from us. So it was symbolic, and to me it was about a renegotiation of power. It just happened through data.
I'd like to continue that thread because I think it is one of the most important things. When convening people, and I think you talked about creating those safe spaces as well, and it really is like, how do we give more voice? But who takes on the voices at the right time, to me, is also really important, because one of the things I can say that working at the bank, I love my colleagues. They're just such amazing human beings, high caliber, very dedicated to their work. But they're also holding an expertise mindset. I would never want them to let go of that, but rather not. The real issue is that to not be limited by that. And you know that quote that Henry Ford has, which is, if I asked people what they would have wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So it's a bit hard to ask people directly just in the community to solve everything entirely, because it's beyond their set of experiences. You can't necessarily ask them to imagine what a solution could look like, especially when you have other experiences that can bring to bear. Now, that's separate from the power dynamics, which can still be shifted by creating, not having necessarily top-down and not necessarily just bottom-up. I remember I was at a conference once, and a gentleman said to me, I really hate bottom-up solutions. They're just top-down, upside down. And I kind of understood what he meant, which is you can still you're just inversing the things sometimes where you get other sets of problems and a whole bunch of other opportunities that are lost as well. So how do you work in this sort of mezzanine level in between, where you can bring the people with the expertise, because often they have hands on very big levers to really influence change very quickly, but the sensitization of the problem happens on the ground level through affected community members that can give you much deeper insights as to why certain changes will get traction and others won't. And so when you can create that in-between level and platform to bring both sets of experiences, and then that's, for me, where this co-designing starts to happen properly. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open the questions up to the floor. Does anyone have a question? Hang on, we have a roving mic. Sorry, who's coming? Thank you.
Kerry, we know you're not a designer, you're not wearing black. That's okay.
Well, it's so obvious because I'm not wearing black.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Nancy.
Give it away.
But
the unspoken rule.
You're not a designer, but you're employing all these design tools. How did you discover them, and then how do you find designers to work with on your projects? Or what do you look for in designers to work with you?
I'm stuck because we don't work with designers. What I have found is people that are attracted to work with us, and people we are constantly seeking, are people who are systems thinkers. I think that is one of the core sort of I think everyone can become systems thinkers, but there are some people with just a natural aptitude. They see all of the moving parts, they see them changing all the time, and it's like, how do we create their whole vision, their whole drive is how do we get others to see the system so we can work out where to intervene in it better and where to nudge it better. Mm-hmm. And I think those people could be called designers, they could be called systems leaders, they could be called change maker. Like I don't want to. To me, that it's not the field of design that's driving this. It's the field of saying program interventions are not enough. We actually need to be working at a systems level and a program level. And how do we find the narrative and the story and the pathways to get there? Now, if that is design, if that's a designer mindset, then we need more of it. In my world, that's not called designing. Have I answered your question?
Hi, this is also a question for Kerry. The story that you told about Burke, at what point was your organisation brought in to help them? And how did they approach you and ask you to come in and facilitate what they were up to?
So they extended the invitation. So in a way, Burke called the group in Sydney, and I was involved in a group in Sydney around justice reform. And when we spent time in Burke with the community, this neutral convener role wasn't one that there were people in the community that had the skills, but not the neutrality. So for the first 2 years, I partnered with people who had the systems view, and I was extended the licence to be the neutral convener. They now convene themselves. So this whole thing about building capacity in the system to be able to do that work is, even though they don't have neutrality, everyone has a stake. All the family members have a stake in the change. Who's authorised to do the work became negotiated, and now I support members of the community to do the work themselves. So it's been a constant negotiation. Changes all the time.
Hi there. Oh, it's really good. This is for both of you, actually. But using a phrase that Kerry said earlier, when you talk about social change taking time and it not being an event, how do you set or help set expectations around when the impact will be achieved, especially if the impact isn't something as tangible as your data?
So to me, that's the role of the collaborators. So a group of people, hopefully as diverse as possible, come together, and they're basically saying, we're going to work till we see this type of change. That's sort of a shared agenda for change. The thing is that what I've been learning is some of that change arrives much faster than you'd ever expect, and some of that change, you're always working on these different scales. So I'm learning that the trick is to allow time. I don't think we should be looking at impact under 7, like large-scale impact under 7 years. But what we have to be doing is looking for what are the proxies of that, and they're happening actually now. How many people are shifting towards systems thinking? How many people are collaborating? What are the smaller scale impacts we're seeing as a result of this shift in the way we work and the way we think? They're all proxies to what can happen later. So to me, we've got to have a much more nuanced way of talking about impact and measurement, and understanding what can we measure in the short term, medium term, long term. And I think there's a lot of exciting developments around that happening at the moment. And the last thing I'd say is I don't think the work ever finishes, because, say, Burke is mobilising, their hot button was around young people not going to jail. Now they're making significant inroads into that, but now they've discovered they have this ability to make change that they thought was out of their reach. They're not satisfied with just that alone. Like their second wave agenda is starting to emerge. So I don't think these things have definitive stop dates. And it's a curiosity to me about the role of design, because to me, change needs support or needs enabling. The conditions need to be constantly curated, and that never stops either. Answer your question?
Yeah. One of the things I think, working with governments, because with the World Bank, the client is always the government. We're only there in those countries at the invitation of those governments too. And so sometimes they think in just their term periods. So you've got 3-4 years to be able to really move the needle. And for large-scale systemic change, as Kerry said, it doesn't happen in such short term periods. But when it does happen, it's usually not through government or the development community. It's because of huge technological shift or something else that's a breakthrough that creates this sort of rupture. So those aren't always very predictable, especially when you're looking at it through a policy lens or a government lens. And so it becomes very difficult. It's a little bit like trying to predict the weather. What is the temperature going to be on a particular day 3 years from now? The further out, the less confident you are about what it could be, other than relying on what it was on that day this year or the year before. So that's the only sort of point, that reference point you have. So what I suppose I'm saying is, in one way, we don't have the time period and the luxury with a lot of the work that we do for the people that are asked to make the decisions, ministers and so on. And at the same time, even if we do have that luxury, it's so far out and the world changes at such great pace, and there are so many things that are influencing this because there are more ingredients in the mix. You don't know through that complexity what's going to emerge. It only makes sense when you look at it backwards after something has happened to be able to make sense of it. But it becomes very unpredictable. And this is really coming back to the heart of the difference between a complicated project and a complex project. That the complicated is like building a bridge. It's unique, it's new, but you have the technical expertise to work through it. The complex one is something that happens where through its dynamism, there's something else that emerges that couldn't be predicted or seen. And so you're kind of hoping to be able to shape the influence as it goes along. And that's where I think the building in the agility and a different mindset into organisations is probably more important than the Gantt chart that goes for 7 years. Yeah.
So can I relay the question, because you went on mic? When have you seen power renegotiated before a crisis, and what has enabled that renegotiation to happen without a sort of catalytic event? Have I got it right? So when have you seen that happen?
Yeah. I remember speaking to a disaster manager from the Red Cross who was incredibly thoughtful and described how during a state of a crisis, the norms of every day, the rules of every day, the laws of every day don't apply, precisely because a crisis is a disruption of norms. And so you're going into a very different state, but these are always considered as surprises, but maybe not, because disaster managers see the cycle happen over and over and over again. And so that's why a lot of effort and conversation has been around resilience and preparedness, because we know certain vulnerabilities that we have. We can take stock of them. We know what's at risk. And the greater the assets that we have, the greater set of vulnerabilities that we have as well. So a good way I found to think through this when more in the humanitarian space was when something goes bang, you have a crisis. How you manage or mismanage that is what elevates it to a disaster. And so that's what disaster management is. It's stopping a crisis from getting to a disaster. And there are certain patterns that you can look at. And in the preparedness space, you know that there are certain vulnerabilities, because what will often happen is that the crisis is a flood. The disaster is the social dimensions where that flood exposes all the vulnerabilities that were dormant and nobody really saw them, or rather they neglected them. They were like, they're not rupturing, we can kind of focus on other things. But then time wasn't taken to actually resolve them. And so if you can see certain vulnerabilities, and they do happen at a very intimate and sometimes informal level, it's better to invest the time there, because it's going to be at least a tenfold effort on the other side when the crisis actually gets to a disaster. I do think that we have ways of being sensitised to it. I just don't think they've been necessarily always formalised, or that expertise has been captured as to how to address vulnerabilities beforehand.
So I think there's an art around urgency. So, you know, crisis is an urgency that's externally driven. We talk a lot with communities about how do you create urgency without anyone getting hurt. And I think there is, like, if you think about how many Aboriginal kids are in custody today, that is a national crisis. And yet none of us have it, there's no sense of that, really, unless you're a family member. So I think this sort of definition of crisis is a funny one, but I have seen power renegotiated without a crisis from, and I don't have the technical language for this, it's from people who really understand how to create a cool table. So it's like, here's how status quo is over here, it's super uncool, all business as usual. That's everything about incarceration of Aboriginal kids. Everyone's doing their little bit as best they can, and actually none of it's adding up to enough. So you create a new table and you get a sense, it's about how to convene and grow authority, how to leverage narrative, how to create an invitation or a sense of urgency that shifts people from this very status quo dormant state, and they start gravitating slowly, one by one, over to this table. Now, in a way, that's what Just Reinvest and Burke are doing. There's some extraordinary power renegotiation happening through an initiative called Empowered Communities in Australia, which is Aboriginal leadership trying to renegotiate its relationship with government. And that has been done through creating a cool table. Like, the best Aboriginal thinkers in the country getting together and writing, you know, basically an invitation. Now, so I think it is about how to leverage and grow authority. And that means taking risks, working with the authority you have and acknowledging it, and finding the allies. Like, it's very political work when you don't have a crisis or a recognised crisis.
We've got like 3 minutes and we have to be out of here.
Oh no!
Well, 4 minutes. Maybe we can have one more if it's a quick one. So, yeah. Yeah. And just hang on behind you, the mic.
So this is for Mathan. I was wondering, so when you're working in a global field, especially in an area where, like we were talking about, governments and infrastructure changes quite frequently, what sort of checks do you have to ensure sustainability in the development process, or is it the hope and faith that the human-centered design process itself leads to a sustainable program or product?
Yeah. I can tell you what the inverse of that is, which is when things, when the chances of sustainability are much greatly diminished when things are designed at headquarters but aren't truly understood what all the nuance is and why things were engineered that way. And so if people don't understand the full story, but then they're taking on these designed outcomes, so whether that be policy or a piece of infrastructure, but it doesn't quite connect with their needs and their lives, they're not misbehaving, but they don't know how to behave around this thing that's suddenly come into their lives. And so part of it, I think, is when the co-design process that we speak about is one, to surface the way that it could be done according to the affected community members that are going to inherit this. But also, I've just found that purely by giving voice to people, that they want to own it a little bit more because they see themselves as having owned it by co-designing it with them. And that's from everything in projects in the field to even working with students. I've gone in and said, this syllabi, how do we make this the course that you want to take and the one that I want to teach? We can co-design this, so let's write it up together. And that's led to them taking a lot more leadership, and I found that the quality of work that comes back is a lot higher because it's something that they set for themselves as goals. So I do think there's a co-design part, but when it's just held within one particular pocket, that's when things become less likely to have stickiness. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to have to end it here. Before we go, I'd like to acknowledge Vivid Ideas and thank them for hosting us and the MCA for this amazing location, and what a pleasure it is to be here with this great view. Please sign up to our newsletter. We have talks every 2 or 3 months at the UPS Design Innovation Research Centre. If you'd like to come and continue the conversation now, we're going to the Orient Hotel, and so please come and join us for a glass of wine. I'd like to big thank you to our presenters and to the Social Design Sydney team for everything they do for this. And one last shout out to the awesome AV team who've been super awesome and helpful, and big up. Thank you.